That man couldn't have imagined the life we'd built, the relationships we'd formed, the difference we'd made in other people's lives. But he'd had one thing that made everything else possible: the ability to hear suffering and respond to it, even when he was suffering himself. The willingness to act with compassion, even when the world had shown him little compassion in return. I'd saved Hope from that pile of debris. But the truth was more complicated than that simple narrative. We'd saved each other, day by day, choice by choice, by refusing to let each other face the darkness alone. We'd proven that love isn't a luxury available only to those who have everything figured out. It's a necessity, a survival tool, a way of fighting back against a world that sometimes seems determined to crush the vulnerable. The most beautiful thing about rescue is that you never know who's saving whom. But in the end, it doesn't matter. What matters is that when you hear the sound of someone crying in the darkness, you don't keep walking. You stop. You listen. You dig through whatever rubble stands between you and another soul. And you refuse to let them face their fight alone. Because that's how hope survives. Not in grand gestures or perfect circumstances, but in the simple decision to care, to show up, to be present in someone else's moment of need. That's how we save each other. That's how we save ourselves. And that's how a homeless man and a buried puppy became living proof that love really can conquer everything, one small act of kindness at a time. Hope and I had learned that rescue isn't a one-time event. It's a daily choice, a commitment to showing up for each other no matter what storms might come. In the end, we'd both been buried alive by circumstances beyond our control. But we dug each other out, and in doing so, we discovered that the most powerful force in the universe isn't money or status or security. It's the simple decision to love without conditions, to see worth in every living thing, and to never, ever give up on the possibility that tomorrow can be better than today. The first thing I remember is the sound, not the wind howling through the abandoned buildings, not the distant hum of traffic from the highway, but this tiny, desperate whimpering that seemed to come from the earth itself. I was digging through the dumpster behind Murphy's Diner, my hands already numb from the October cold, when I heard it again. A sound so small, so broken, that it made my chest tighten in a way I hadn't felt in years. I stopped moving. My breath formed clouds in the freezing air as I listened, wondering if my mind was playing tricks on me again. But there it was, a cry for help that seemed to be coming from beneath the pile of construction debris someone had dumped near the alley's dead end. I'd love to know, what time is it where you are right now? And which city or state are you watching from? My name is Marcus, and 3 years ago, I lost everything. Not just my job, not just my apartment, but my faith in the world itself. The streets of Detroit had become my home. And trust me when I say that the concrete doesn't care about your dreams or your broken heart. It just takes and takes until you forget what it feels like to give anything back. I'd been living rough for so long that most people looked right through me, like I was part of the scenery. Just another invisible man with dirty clothes and hollow eyes, shuffling through their clean world without making a sound. I'd learned to survive on scraps, to find shelter in doorways, to make friends with the shadows that other people feared. But that morning was different. October 15th. I remember the date because it was the anniversary of the day everything fell apart. 3 years since the factory closed. 3 years since Sarah took the kids and moved to her mother's place in Ohio. 3 years since I'd felt like I mattered to anyone or anything. The whimpering came again, stronger this time, and I felt something stir inside me that I thought had died long ago. Hope, maybe. Or just the stubborn part of my soul that refused to give up completely. I dropped the half-eaten sandwich I'd found and walked toward the sound, my worn sneakers crunching on broken glass and fallen leaves. The debris pile was bigger than I'd first thought. Chunks of concrete, twisted metal, and what looked like the remains of someone's demolished porch. Someone had just dumped it all here like it was nothing. Like this forgotten corner of the world was the perfect place for unwanted things. The crying was definitely coming from underneath it all. I got down on my knees, ignoring the way the cold pavement bit through my threadbare jeans, and started moving pieces of concrete with my bare hands. My fingers were already cracked and bleeding from the harsh weather. But I didn't care. Something was alive under there, something that needed help. And for the first time in 3 years, I had a purpose that went beyond just surviving another day. The first piece of concrete was heavier than it looked, and I had to use both hands to lift it away. Underneath, I could see a small gap in the debris, just big enough for air to get through. The whimpering got louder, more desperate, and I realized I was looking at a makeshift grave that something had managed to survive. My heart was pounding as I worked faster, moving piece after piece of rubble. The cold was making my hands shake, but I couldn't stop. Whatever was down there had been fighting to stay alive, just like I had been, and I'd be damned if I was going to let it give up now. When I moved the next chunk of concrete, I saw it. A tiny paw, muddy and scratched, reaching up through the gap like it was trying to grab onto life itself. The paw was attached to what looked like a German Shepherd puppy, maybe 8 weeks old, covered in dirt and shivering so hard I could see its little body trembling from 3 feet away. The puppy's eyes found mine, and I swear to you, I've never seen anything so full of hope and terror at the same time. Those dark, intelligent eyes seemed to be saying, "Please, please don't leave me here. Please don't let me die alone in the dark." I'd seen a lot of suffering on the streets. I'd watched good people break under the weight of circumstances they couldn't control. I'd held dying men in my arms and listened to their last words. But looking into that puppy's eyes broke something inside me that I didn't even know was still intact. The little guy was trapped under a wooden beam that had fallen across his back legs. He wasn't hurt badly, as far as I could tell, but he was stuck, and he'd been there for who knows how long. His water bowl, an old coffee can that someone had left for him, was bone dry, and there were scratch marks in the dirt where he'd been trying to dig his way out. Someone had buried this puppy alive. Maybe not on purpose. Maybe they'd just dumped the debris without knowing he was there. But the result was the same. This innocent creature had been fighting for his life while the world went on around him, oblivious to his suffering. I worked for what felt like hours, carefully moving each piece of debris so I wouldn't hurt him. My hands were bleeding now, leaving red marks on the concrete. But I didn't feel the pain. All I could focus on was those eyes, watching me, trusting me, believing that I was going to save him even though every human he'd ever known had apparently let him down. The puppy tried to help, scratching at the dirt with his front paws, but he was so weak that he could barely lift his head. I could see his ribs through his matted fur, and his little pink tongue was hanging out like he'd been panting for days. When I finally got the beam off his back legs, he tried to stand but collapsed immediately. He looked up at me with those same hopeful eyes, and I felt tears running down my cheeks for the first time since I'd been on the streets. I reached down and gently lifted him out of his concrete prison. He was so light, so fragile, that I was afraid I might hurt him just by holding him. But as soon as I cradled him against my chest, he stopped shivering. He pressed his little face against my jacket and let out the smallest, most grateful whimper I'd ever heard. That's when I knew my life was about to change again. I looked around the alley, suddenly aware that I had no idea what to do next. I was homeless, broke, and barely surviving myself. I had no food, no money, no place to take this puppy where he'd be safe and warm. But as I felt his tiny heartbeat against my chest, I knew I couldn't abandon him the way the world had abandoned both of us. I named him Hope. I know that sounds cheesy, but in that moment, holding this fragile life in my arms, it felt like hope was exactly what had been missing from my world. Hope that things could get better. Hope that kindness still existed. Hope that maybe, just maybe, we could save each other. The first challenge was food. I had exactly 73 cents in my pocket, and the nearest store was 6 blocks away. Hope was too weak to walk, so I wrapped him in my jacket and carried him, talking to him softly as we made our way through the maze of abandoned buildings and empty lots that made up our neighborhood. People stared at us as we walked, some with curiosity, others with disgust. A few actually crossed the street to avoid us, like homelessness and desperation might be contagious. But I didn't care what they thought anymore. I had something more important than their opinions. I had a reason to keep going. At the corner store, the owner, an elderly Middle Eastern man named Hassan, looked at us suspiciously when we walked in. He'd seen me before, rummaging through his dumpster, and I could tell he was getting ready to kick us out. But when Hope lifted his little head and looked at him with those same trusting eyes that had melted my heart, Hassan's expression softened. I spent my 73 cents on a small can of dog food and a bottle of water. It wasn't much, but it was everything I had. Hassan watched me count out the coins, and when I was 3 cents short, he waved his hand and said it was fine. He even gave me a plastic bowl for the water, refusing to take any money for it. We went back to the alley, and I watched Hope eat for the first time since I'd found him. He was so hungry that he could barely control himself, but he kept looking up at me between bites, like he wanted to make sure I wasn't going to disappear. I'd never felt needed like that before, not even by my own family. That night, I made a shelter for us out of cardboard boxes and plastic tarps behind Murphy's Diner. It wasn't much, but it kept the wind out, and Hope seemed to feel safe there. He curled up against my chest, and for the first time in 3 years, I fell asleep feeling like I had something to protect. The next few days were hard, harder than anything I'd experienced on the streets so far, because now I wasn't just responsible for myself. Hope needed food every day, clean water, and medical attention that I couldn't afford. His back legs were still weak from being trapped, and he limped when he tried to walk. I started doing things I'd never done before. I asked for help. I swallowed my pride and approached people on the street, not asking for money for myself, but for Hope. I told them his story, showed them his trusting eyes, and slowly, people began to respond. A woman named Janet, who worked at the coffee shop on 5th Street, started saving leftover pastries for us. She'd come out to the alley every morning with a paper bag full of day-old muffins and cookies, and she always had a gentle word for Hope. She was the first person in years to look at me like I was a human being instead of a problem to be solved. Dr. Martinez, the veterinarian whose clinic was 3 blocks from our alley, agreed to see Hope for free after I showed up at his back door with the puppy in my arms and tears in my eyes. He examined Hope carefully, gave him vaccinations, and treated the cuts on his paws from trying to dig out of the debris pile. He also did something that surprised me. He looked me in the eye and asked if I was okay. Not just physically, but really okay. No one had asked me that question in so long that I didn't know how to answer it. Hope was getting stronger every day. His limp was disappearing, his coat was getting shinier, and his eyes had lost that desperate, frightened look. He'd learned to play, chasing leaves in the wind and barking at pigeons with the pure joy that only a puppy can have. Watching him discover the world made me remember what it felt like to be amazed by simple things. But more than that, Hope was changing me. I started paying attention to my appearance again, washing my clothes in the public restroom at the park, combing my hair, trying to look like someone who deserved the trust that Hope placed in me every day. I wanted to be worthy of his faith. People in the neighborhood began to know us. We'd walk the same route every morning, past the coffee shop where Janet would wave from the window, through the park where Hope would chase squirrels, down to the river where we'd sit and watch the sunrise together. I'd tell him about my dreams, about the life I used to have, about the mistakes I'd made and the people I'd lost. And somehow, talking to Hope helped me understand things about myself that I'd been too afraid to face. I realized that I'd been punishing myself for failing, for losing my job, for not being strong enough to hold my family together when everything fell apart. I'd been living like I deserved to suffer, like homelessness was my penance for not being good enough. But Hope didn't see me that way. To him, I was the person who'd saved his life, who'd given him food when I had none, who'd kept him warm on cold nights even when it meant I was colder. To him, I was a hero. One morning in November, about a month after I'd found Hope, we were sitting by the river watching the sun come up when a woman approached us. She was well-dressed, probably in her 50s, with kind eyes and graying hair. She'd been walking her own dog, a golden retriever named Buddy, and Hope had been trying to play with him through the fence. Her name was Margaret, and she worked for a local nonprofit that helped homeless people find housing and employment. She'd been watching us for several days, she said, impressed by the obvious bond between Hope and me. She wanted to know if I'd be interested in getting help finding a place to live. I was suspicious at first. I'd been disappointed by social services before, sent from office to office, given forms to fill out and promises that never materialized. But Margaret was different. She sat down on the park bench beside me, let Hope climb into her lap, and talked to me like I was her equal. She told me about a program that provided transitional housing for homeless individuals who were working towards self-sufficiency. The apartments were small, but they allowed pets, and they came with job placement services and counseling support. The waiting list was long, she said, but she thought Hope and I might be good candidates. I wanted to say yes immediately, but I was scared. I'd been living on the streets for so long that the idea of having walls around me again felt overwhelming. What if I couldn't handle it? What if I messed up again and lost everything, including Hope? Margaret seemed to understand my hesitation. She gave me her card and told me to think about it. But she also said something that stuck with me. She said that Hope had already proven I was capable of taking care of someone else. And maybe it was time to start taking care of myself too. That night, as Hope slept curled up against my side in our cardboard shelter, I thought about what Margaret had said. I looked at this beautiful, healthy, happy puppy who'd been buried alive just a month ago, and I realized that if he could survive what had happened to him, if he could learn to trust again, then maybe I could too. The next morning, I called Margaret. The application process took weeks. There were interviews, background checks, and meetings with social workers who wanted to understand my situation. Through it all, Hope was my constant companion, sitting quietly in waiting rooms, charming everyone he met with his gentle nature and intelligent eyes. Dr. Martinez wrote a letter of recommendation for us, describing Hope's recovery and our obvious bond. Hassan from the corner store did the same, talking about how he'd watched me care for Hope even when I had nothing for myself. Even Janet from the coffee shop wrote a letter, describing how seeing Hope and me together every morning had reminded her that kindness and love could exist in the darkest circumstances. In December, just before Christmas, Margaret called with good news. We'd been approved for an apartment in a transitional housing facility on the east side of town. It was a studio apartment, barely 400 square feet, but it had a kitchen, a bathroom, and most importantly, it allowed pets. I'll never forget the day we moved in. Hope ran around the empty apartment like he couldn't believe it was real, sniffing every corner, testing out the echoes when he barked. When I opened the can of dog food for his dinner, he ate it off a real plate in a real kitchen for the first time in his life. That night, instead of sleeping on cardboard and concrete, we slept on an actual mattress. Hope sprawled out like he owned the place, his legs stretched out in every direction, completely relaxed and safe. I lay there listening to him breathe, grateful for every single thing that had led us to this moment. The job placement program helped me find work as a maintenance assistant at a local elementary school. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest, and it paid enough for me to cover rent and take care of Hope properly. The kids at the school loved him when I brought him by after hours, and their laughter reminded me what joy sounded like. But the real transformation happened slowly, over months of small victories and gradual healing. I started saving money. I bought Hope a Real bed toys, a collar with his name engraved on it. I started cooking real meals instead of eating scraps. I got a library card and started reading again, something I hadn't done since I'd lost my house. Most importantly, I started believing in myself again. Every morning when I woke up and saw Hope's trusting face, I remembered that I was capable of keeping promises, of taking care of someone who depended on me, of being the person someone else needed me to be. Spring came early that year, and Hope and I started taking longer walks through the city. We'd explore new neighborhoods, meet other dog owners at the park, and slowly, I began to feel like I belonged somewhere again. People knew us, the maintenance guy and his German shepherd, and they'd wave when they saw us coming. One day in April, we were walking past the old alley where I'd found Hope buried under that pile of debris. Someone had cleaned it up since then, hauled away the concrete and trash, planted some flowers in the empty lot behind Murphy's Diner. But I could still see the exact spot where Hope had been trapped, where his little paw had reached up through the rubble, where our lives had changed forever. Hope seemed to remember it too. He sniffed around the area, his tail wagging, and then he looked up at me with those same intelligent eyes, but now they were full of confidence instead of fear. He'd grown into a beautiful dog, strong and healthy, with a shiny coat and bright eyes that missed nothing. As we stood there, I thought about the person I'd been when I first heard that tiny whimpering sound. Broken, hopeless, invisible to the world. I'd been buried alive just as surely as Hope had been, trapped under the weight of my own failures and disappointments. But sometimes, salvation comes in the smallest packages. Sometimes, the act of saving someone else is exactly what you need to save yourself. Sometimes, love is just recognizing that you're both fighting the same fight, and deciding that neither of you has to fight it alone. 6 months later, I got a call from Sarah. My ex-wife had heard through mutual friends that I was back on my feet, that I had a place to live and a job. She wanted to know if I'd like to see the kids, maybe start rebuilding the relationships I'd thought were lost forever. I said yes, of course, but I also told her about Hope. I explained that he wasn't just my dog. He was my partner, my reason for getting up every morning, the living reminder that second chances are real if you're brave enough to take them. When Sarah brought the kids to meet us, Hope was perfect. He was gentle with them, patient when they wanted to pet him, playful when they wanted to throw his ball. But more than that, he seemed to understand that this was important, that these people mattered to me, and that being on his best behavior was his way of taking care of me the same way I'd taken care of him. My daughter Emma, who was 7 now, fell in love with Hope immediately. She sat on the floor of our small apartment, letting him rest his head in her lap, and told me that she'd always known I'd come back. My son Jake, who was 9 and had grown so much since I'd seen him last, wanted to know everything about how I'd found Hope, about our adventures on the streets, about what it felt like to save someone's life. As I told them the story, I realized that it wasn't really about me saving Hope at all. It was about how Hope had saved me. He'd given me a reason to get up when I wanted to give up. He taught me that love doesn't require perfect circumstances or endless resources. It just requires showing up every day and choosing to care about someone other than yourself. He'd shown me that being needed is one of the most powerful forces in the world, and that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to let someone face their darkness alone. That night, after Sarah and the kids had gone home, Hope and I sat on our small balcony watching the sunset over the city. In the distance, I could see the neighborhood where we'd lived on the streets, the alleys where we'd found each other, the path that had led us from desperation to hope to something that looked a lot like home. Hope had his head resting on my lap, his eyes half closed in the warm evening air. He was completely at peace, completely trusting, completely certain that whatever tomorrow brought, we'd face it together. And for the first time in years, so was I. Because I'd learned something important in that alley behind Murphy's Diner. Something that had taken months to fully understand. We don't save each other in the dramatic, movie moment way that we imagine. We save each other quietly, daily, by refusing to let the people we love disappear into their own darkness. We save each other by showing up, by sharing our food when we have none, by making shelter out of cardboard and love, by believing in second chances even when the world has given us every reason to stop believing. We save each other by recognizing that we're all just trying to dig our way out from under the rubble of our own broken dreams, reaching up through the darkness, hoping that someone will see our hand and refuse to walk away. Sometimes, if we're very lucky, that someone is a homeless man who hears crying in an alley and decides that the sound of suffering is not something he can ignore. And sometimes, if we're even luckier, that someone turns out to need saving just as much as we do. Hope is 5 years old now, and we live in a real house with a yard where he can chase squirrels and bark at the mailman. I have a better job, a relationship with my children that grows stronger every day, and a future that looks nothing like the past I thought had defined me. But every morning, when I wake up and see Hope's trusting face on the pillow next to mine, I remember that moment in the alley when everything changed. I remember the sound of his tiny whimpering, the feeling of his heartbeat against my chest, the way his eyes looked at me like I was capable of miracles. Because maybe I was, maybe we all are, when we choose love over indifference, when we choose to act instead of walking away, when we choose to believe that every life has value, even when the world seems determined to prove us wrong. The weeks that followed our move into the apartment were filled with discoveries that most people take for granted. Hope had never experienced running water before, and the first time I gave him a bath in an actual bathtub, he looked at me like I was performing magic. The warm water seemed to melt away not just the dirt from our street days, but some invisible weight he'd been carrying. I watched him discover the simple pleasure of a soft blanket, the way he'd circle 3 times before settling down, his body finally relaxing completely for the first time since I'd found him. He learned what it meant to have his own food bowl, his own corner of the world where no one could take anything away from him. But the real healing happened in the quiet moments. The way Hope would position himself between me and the door whenever someone knocked, still protective despite his gentle nature. The way he'd wake up in the middle of the night and check to make sure I was still there, his cold nose nudging my hand until I stirred enough to reassure him that I wasn't going anywhere. Those first few months in the apartment, I started having nightmares again, not about the streets, but about the night terrors that had plagued me since losing everything. I'd wake up gasping, my heart racing, convinced that I was back in that alley, back to having nothing, back to being invisible to the world. But Hope seemed to sense these moments before they fully gripped me. He'd climb onto the bed and press his warm body against mine, his steady breathing serving as an anchor to reality. His presence reminded me that I wasn't that broken man anymore, that I'd built something real and good and worth protecting. Dr. Martinez became more than just Hope's veterinarian during those early days. He started checking on me too, asking about my job, my housing situation, whether I was taking care of myself as well as I was taking care of Hope. He'd lost his own home to foreclosure several years earlier, he told me, and he understood the shame that comes with falling through society's cracks. One afternoon in late spring, Dr. Martinez asked if I'd be interested in helping out at the clinic on weekends. Nothing medical, just cleaning kennels, walking dogs, helping with basic care for the animals whose owners couldn't afford full treatment. The pay wasn't much, but it would give me extra income and, more importantly, a chance to give back to the community that had helped Hope and me survive. Working at the clinic changed something fundamental in how I saw myself. I wasn't just taking anymore. I was contributing. The other volunteers, mostly retired folks and college students, welcomed me without question. They saw my dedication to the animals, the way Hope and I worked as a team, and they treated me like I belonged there. Mrs. Chun, a retired teacher who volunteered every Saturday, started bringing lunch for all of us. She'd pack extra portions and insist that Hope and I take them home, saying her garden was producing more vegetables than she could possibly eat. These small acts of inclusion, of being seen as worthy of care and friendship, rebuilt something in me that I thought was permanently damaged. The children at the elementary school where I worked maintenance began to recognize me too. At first, they'd been shy around me, maybe sensing the rough edges that came from years on the streets. But when I started bringing Hope to work occasionally, staying late to clean classrooms when the building was empty, everything changed. Hope had a natural gentleness with children that amazed everyone who saw it. He'd sit perfectly still while they petted him, his tail wagging slowly, his eyes soft and patient. When little Maria Rodriguez, a first grader who barely spoke English, fell and scraped her knee on the playground, Hope somehow sensed her distress from inside the building and started whining until I brought him outside. He walked right up to Maria and sat down beside her, resting his head on her lap while she cried. He stayed there until her tears stopped, and from that day forward, she'd wave at us every morning when we passed her classroom. Her teacher, Mrs. Patterson, started inviting Hope and me to special events, reading time, even the school's therapy dog program meetings. The principal, Mr. Thompson, was initially hesitant about having Hope on school grounds. But when he saw the positive effect Hope had on the children, especially the ones who were struggling with anxiety or behavioral issues, he started asking if we could visit more often. Hope became an unofficial therapy dog, providing comfort to kids who needed it most. There was Tommy Williams, a third grader whose parents were going through a messy divorce. He'd act out in class, get into fights, refuse to do his homework. But when Hope was around, Tommy transformed into a different child. He'd read to Hope, tell him about his day, share his lunch with him. Tommy's grades improved, his behavior stabilized, and his teachers started asking what miracle had occurred. Hope and I began visiting nursing homes on Sunday afternoons. The elderly residents lit up when we walked into their common rooms, and Hope seemed to understand exactly what each person needed. He'd sit quietly with Mrs. Ferguson, who had dementia and rarely spoke anymore, but who would smile and stroke his fur for hours. He'd play gentle games with Mr. Valdez, who was recovering from a stroke and needed motivation for his physical therapy. These visits reminded me that loneliness doesn't discriminate. Whether you're homeless on the streets or forgotten in a care facility, the basic human need for connection, for feeling seen and valued, remains the same. Hope bridged those gaps effortlessly, offering unconditional love to everyone he met. My relationship with my children continued to evolve slowly, carefully. Sarah started allowing weekend visits, then overnight stays. Emma and Jake would spend hours with Hope, teaching him tricks, taking him to the park, including him in their games like he was their long-lost brother. Jake, who'd always been the more reserved of my children, opened up to me through Hope. He'd ask detailed questions about our time on the streets, not from morbid curiosity, but from a genuine desire to understand what we'd been through. He wanted to know how Hope had survived being buried, how I'd found the strength to keep going, how we'd learned to take care of each other. These conversations were painful sometimes, forcing me to relive the darkest period of my life. But they were also healing, because Jake's questions helped me see that period differently. Instead of just being a time of failure and loss, it became the foundation for everything good that had followed. It was the time when I'd learned what really mattered, when I'd discovered that my capacity for love hadn't died along with my old life. Emma, meanwhile, had appointed herself Hope's official protector. She'd insist on walking him whenever she visited, brushing his coat until it gleamed, making sure his water bowl was always full. She'd tell anyone who would listen about how her daddy had saved Hope's life. Her voice filled with pride that made my chest tight with emotion. One Saturday morning in July, Emma came running into the apartment with tears streaming down her face. She'd been at the park with Sarah when she saw a man kicking a stray cat. The man had yelled at Emma when she tried to intervene, telling her to mind her own business. She was devastated, confused about why someone would hurt an animal that couldn't defend itself. I held her while she cried, Hope pressing against both of us, sensing her distress. I told her about the day I'd found Hope, about how scared and alone he'd been, about how saving him had taught me that sometimes the most important thing you can do is refuse to walk away when someone needs help. Emma listened intently, her tears gradually stopping. Then she asked if we could go back to the park to look for the cat. We spent the rest of the day searching, Hope leading the way with his nose to the ground. We found the cat hiding under a bridge, injured but alive. Dr. Martinez treated her for free, and Emma insisted on naming her Lucky. Sarah allowed Emma to keep Lucky at their house, and the cat became a living reminder of the lesson Hope had taught our family. That kindness matters, that every life has value, that sometimes the most courageous thing you can do is care about someone who seems forgotten by the rest of the world. As autumn approached, marking a full year since I'd found Hope, I realized that our story had rippled outward in ways I never could have imagined. The nursing home started a regular pet therapy program, with Hope and me as founding volunteers. The elementary school implemented a new anti-bullying curriculum centered around empathy and kindness, using Hope's story as a teaching tool. Mrs. Chun from the clinic started a small non-profit organization called Second Chances, providing temporary housing and veterinary care for pets whose owners were experiencing homelessness. She'd been inspired, she said, by watching Hope and me support each other through our recovery, and she wanted to ensure that other people wouldn't have to choose between getting help and keeping their beloved animals. Dr. Martinez expanded his free clinic hours, recruiting other veterinarians to donate their time to animals whose owners couldn't afford care. Hassan from the corner store started a small food bank in his basement, stocking pet food alongside human necessities. Janet from the coffee shop began hosting fundraisers, with proceeds going to local homeless services. Each of these developments felt like a testament to Hope's impact on our community. A single puppy, buried alive and forgotten, had become the catalyst for a network of compassion that was making life better for countless other creatures, both human and animal. But the most profound changes were the ones happening inside me. I'd started seeing a counselor through the transitional housing program, working through the depression and trauma that had kept me trapped in cycles of self-destruction. It was hard work, forcing me to confront the shame and anger I'd carried for so long. Hope attended every session with me, lying quietly at my feet while I talked through the pain of losing my job, my marriage, my sense of self-worth. He seemed to understand that these conversations were important, that healing required speaking truths that had been buried as deeply as he'd been buried under that pile of debris. My counselor, Dr. Rebecca Santos, helped me understand that my homelessness hadn't been a moral failing or a sign of weakness. It had been the result of systemic problems, economic circumstances beyond my control, and a society that often criminalizes poverty instead of addressing its root causes. But more importantly, she helped me see that my recovery hadn't happened in spite of my time on the streets, but because of what I'd learned there. I'd discovered reserves of strength I didn't know I possessed. I'd learned to survive on almost nothing, to find beauty in the smallest gestures of kindness, to recognize the fundamental humanity in everyone I encountered. Most crucially, I'd learned that my worth as a person wasn't determined by my productivity, my income, or my ability to conform to society's expectations. It was determined by my capacity to love, to show up for someone who needed me, to refuse to let suffering go unnoticed or unaddressed. Hope had been both my teacher and my student in this process. I'd taught him to trust again, to believe that not all humans would hurt him, to accept love without constantly looking over his shoulder for the next betrayal. But he taught me that resilience isn't about avoiding pain. It's about finding meaning in the midst of suffering, about choosing hope even when hope seems impossible. As winter approached again, Hope and I developed new routines that felt like the rhythms of a real life. Saturday mornings at the clinic, Sunday afternoons at the nursing home. Weekday evenings helping Emma with her homework while Hope supervised from his bed in the corner. I'd started taking night classes at the community college, working toward a degree in social work, inspired by the people who'd helped us, and driven by a desire to help others navigate the systems that had once seemed impossible to me. The apartment had been transformed from a sterile temporary space into something that felt like home. Hope's toys were scattered across the living room floor. Photos of our adventures covered the refrigerator. A small herb garden grew on the windowsill, tended by Emma during her visits and maintained by me between her stays. But the most meaningful change was internal. I'd stopped waiting for the other shoe to drop, stopped expecting everything to fall apart again. I'd learned to trust in the stability we'd built, to believe that good things could last, that love could be a foundation strong enough to support whatever challenges might come. One evening in December, almost exactly a year after we'd moved into the apartment, I was sitting on the couch grading papers from my night class when Hope suddenly lifted his head and looked toward the door. A moment later, there was a soft knock. When I opened it, I found Margaret standing in the hallway, holding a small wrapped package and wearing the biggest smile I'd ever seen. She'd been promoted, she told me, to director of the entire transitional housing program. But more importantly, she'd come to tell me that Hope and I had become the program's success story, the example they used to show other clients that recovery was possible, that lives could be rebuilt, that second chances were real. The package contained a photo album she'd compiled, documenting our journey from that first day in the park when she'd approached us, through all the milestones that had followed. Photos of Hope's first vet visit, our apartment application approval, my first day at work, the kids' first visit, Hope's therapy dog certification, my enrollment in college. Looking through those photos, I was struck by the gradual transformation visible in both Hope and me. In the early pictures, we both looked guarded, uncertain, like we were still waiting for someone to tell us we didn't belong. But as the pages turned, our expressions relaxed, our postures opened, our smiles became genuine and unguarded. The final photo in the album was one Margaret had taken just a few weeks earlier, during Hope's certification ceremony as an official therapy dog. Hope was wearing his new vest, sitting proudly beside my chair, both of us surrounded by the community of people who'd become our extended family. The faces in that photo told the real story of our recovery. We hadn't just found housing and employment, we'd found our place in the world. That night, as Hope and I settled into bed in our warm, safe apartment, I thought about the man I'd been a year and a half earlier. Broken, invisible, convinced that his best days were behind him.